the best leaders always put the team member first. That doesn't mean that we abdicate our responsibility to be good stewards of the organization. That doesn't mean that we forget about doing all the things we're responsible to do. If we think about people first, individuals and groups of people, that tends to have really positive effects along the way.
Welcome everybody to this edition of Experimenter's Mindset. I am really excited to be joined by Louis Gump, the author of the Inside Innovator, which was a wonderful book that I was able to read last week. Based in Atlanta, we've known each other for a couple months now through one of the Innovators dinners. He is, so many things. Pragmatic optimist is one of the things that you describe yourself as, which I love. You were an entrepreneur in a variety of enterprises, an entrepreneur, CEO of a couple startups and companies. It just spans the gamut. I love it. Tell us a little bit about yourself from your perspective, and we'll just get into it.
Oh, happy to do that. And thanks for having me on the show, AJ. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially with this idea of the experimenter's mindset and just looking at ways to try things, even as we contribute and grow. For my own background, and you mentioned the book, in addition to being the author of the Inside Innovator, I'm president of Cambion Solutions, which is a consulting company that helps people and organizations grow. And my background is in a mix of larger companies and smaller ones. I worked at the Weather Channel as the head of mobile. I worked at CNN as the head of mobile. And I also worked at Cox Communications, the third largest cable provider in the US, as the leader of their advertising division. In addition to that, I served as CEO of two small digital media companies, one named LSN Mobile and one named NewsOn. And as a result of those experiences, the contrast of the things that are required to lead within a larger organization versus the things that are required to excel in a smaller one just became so clear. And I wanted to write about that and learn about that. And so I've had a chance to kind of speak with a lot of people who do this really well. It's been an exciting journey.
That's amazing. And I love the fact that you've seen both sides of the equation, because I know that there's a lot of people, myself included. I was at, Fortune 100s. I worked with enterprise clients, but I also worked at startups, and a lot of people struggle to make the transition between entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship. Is an entire different game. And what we're hoping out of this conversation is people are going to walk away with some insights and tools to help them innovate from inside. If anything, at least some third-party validation that, hey, this is hard in a different way, which I think is great. And one thing I wanted to mention, so head of mobile at Weather Channel and CNN, just for some context of the time frame, this was early on in their mobile endeavors, right? This is like pre-iPhone.
It was so pre-iPhone that we were still using pagers, many of us, and PDAs were a thing. Anybody remember the Palm Pilot? Much less the BlackBerry. By the way, AJ, I think I was one of the last people on the planet to let go of my BlackBerry. It was great, but I was able to carry multiple devices. So I had a candy bar phone in one hand and a BlackBerry in the other, and that seemed to work pretty well. We started early, and I can't take credit for starting that line of business. We called it wireless at the Weather Channel, and we were experimenting with early versions of mobile web and early versions of apps. And in 2001, when I began, really our revenue was almost zero. And our usage footprint, we had some loyal users, but it wasn't really big. And we said, hey, we think mobile is going to be big someday. And so I now think of that business as a 7-year-long overnight success, because we tried things, we built layer upon layer. And then when the iPhone came around and the App Store launched, and it really was the App Store more than the iPhone, but when the App Store launched, we became the most downloaded app in the App Store for a time, and we've always been quite popular there. And I use we loosely these days. And, it's just one of those things where you can make a big difference for a lot of people.
Yeah. Again, amazing. I love that you use we, because you talk about that in your book a little bit about the importance of team and, 7-year overnight success. You talk about that as well. So we're going to get into all of that in this conversation. Let's start from the very beginning. Intrapreneurship. What is it? What's the difference between that and entrepreneurship? Let's just start at the basics.
Okay, so intrapreneurship is the practice of creating value through innovation and growth within a larger organization. And I'll say it again. Intrapreneurship is the practice of creating value through innovation and growth within a larger organization. And it truly is something that is a discipline. It's something that can be learned. And one of the things that was really a catalyst for my writing the book was that it seemed like I knew literally hundreds of people who were doing this kind of work, and we were all recreating the wheel. We were doing it in our own way. And I thought it doesn't have to be that way. This really is something that can be learned. And then, it's not just innovation, not just experimentation, although love both, but it is also growth. And it isn't just doing those things and kind of trying this, trying that, trying the other thing, but ultimately it's about creating value for the organization. It can be financial value, it can be strategic value, it can be, things that reinforce the culture, but whatever it is, it's real value. And lastly, it doesn't have to be a super large organization. And that's a place where I had some things to learn. When I started this, I was thinking mostly very large organization, thousands of employees, over $1 billion. And I quickly learned better. People taught me better. And I also thought, hey, it's mostly for profit. Turns out it could be a nonprofit. It could be a university. It could be the government. So there are lots of different places where this happens. And then catching the second part of your question, the comparison. For entrepreneurship, typically two things need to be true, at least one of them. Either you're the founder or you're the owner to be an entrepreneur. That doesn't mean that you can't practice things that look like entrepreneurship if you aren't one of those. But to be an entrepreneur, you need to be a founder or an owner. And if you are one of those two things, then typically you're going to have a wide range of decision-making responsibility. You're going to have also often in a smaller company, you're going to have a smaller organization that can be more nimble. It often is less complex. Okay. And so when you look at what's required to be an entrepreneur, it involves different approaches to decision making, different approaches to engaging other people, different levels of risk tolerance. And so long story short, they're cousins. They're a little bit like maybe, a tiger and a leopard. But on the other hand, they're not exactly the same. And they're so different that if we think of them as the same thing, then we create all sorts of preventable issues.
This is something that I've seen when I was leading and mentoring product teams while I was at AWS, is the need to come in and really focus on what is the idea, the impact, what are you building, how are you going to do it? But even more importantly than that, it's who are your key leaders and stakeholders that you need to influence? How are you going to bring them in early and often? And how do you keep evangelizing the work every step of the way? Like, there's just so much more effort and care, it seems, that you need to show this is the flag and this is the team and believe in us.
That's absolutely right. The number of stakeholders can be just astounding to accomplish relatively simple things if you're an entrepreneur. And if you do it well, then you end up understanding ways to essentially gain a bunch of advocates. And it isn't just supporting what you do, but also having people around who improve ideas and advance the business or idea or innovation, and ultimately lift each other up. We've talked about this before. I wrote the book for 3 reasons. The first is to help people achieve more. The second is to help people kind of build stronger relationships along the way, because this is inherently difficult. And the third one is to increase personal fulfillment. For those people who achieve a lot and have a strong network of relationships, sometimes they're feeling burned out. And what if we can do this type of work, understand that it involves the involvement of many people, and then find a way to lift ourselves and other people up so that it's sustainable. That's what this is all about.
I really like that you focus on burnout. We talk a lot about burnout and resilience on this channel. I mean, it's a big topic, we all know, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think one of them is expectation setting on yourself. What is the speed that you could achieve things in the organization? What does it take to build relationships? And I want to focus on the relationship part real quick, because when I think about the journey of an entrepreneur, you bucketed it a little bit into 2 ways. There's the new joiner coming in with enthusiasm and I'm going to change the world. And then there's the tenured person who has had time to grow in the organization, has existing relationships, and they could capitalize on it. And I could definitely see the new joiner has some different struggles. So let's dive into that. The beginnings of I just joined and I want to be an entrepreneur.
All right. So part of that depends on what your role is within the organization. And obviously functions matter. You know, are you a product leader, a sales leader, a technology leader, or someone else? However, what I can say for sure is this: if ever there was a time to value differences, this is a great one. And the reason for that is, if we look at somebody who comes in who's new, one of the quickest ways to make a misstep is to do or say something that goes against the culture of the organization you're joining. And one of the best ways to gain momentum and accelerate is to understand the culture and know how to navigate through the organization. Some people call this politics, but a lot of it is less politics than it's just relationships. And I can share the story that I refer to in the book also about joining CNN. And I was brand new. It's a big organization. And by the way, CNN then was part of Turner Broadcasting. And Turner Broadcasting was part of Time Warner. So we have these multiple layers. And then within CNN, we have the U.S. operations, we have the international operations, we have all sorts of different functions. And, you know, there's just a lot of different things that need to be done and people who are responsible for those. And I ended up being paired with a technology leader who knew everybody. And he knew how the organization worked. And he had a lot of knowledge, including technical knowledge that I didn't have. I was coming in with some expertise in mobile and a lot of relationships in the mobile industry. So I had a pretty good understanding of the landscape outside the company in mobile, not just in media, but also with the wireless carriers, service providers, and beyond. He had an understanding of CNN and how it worked and how it intersected with Turner Broadcasting and sometimes more broadly with Time Warner. And the two of us together really accomplished a lot in a short period of time. And when I say the two of us accomplished a lot, I mean that literally. Of course, that's in the context of literally dozens and probably hundreds of people in the first 3 months of my arrival, because we had a lot of work to do in a short period of time.
And when you joined CNN, did you have any inclination that you would be working with this leader, who the leader was, or was it a little bit of a right place, right time, things meshed?
It wasn't totally an accident. And this person's name is Mark. Mark had been part of the interview process along the way, as I recall. I'd have to go back and fact check, but I was well aware of him, and he was so down to earth at the time. And you know, he's just an amazing human in addition to coworker. But we got along very well, and we talked through what needed to be done. And so much of it was a clear understanding and a shared understanding of the goals, and a clear understanding and a shared understanding of the priorities. And once we had that, we were both able to operate in a complementary way with a lot of autonomy. So you get this sort of exponential effect where each day, much less each week, we just made incredible progress, which we needed to do and aspired to do. And there were a lot of alligators to wrestle at that time, and more than any one of us could have on our own.
Totally, I could imagine that. And, there's two parts to what you said. So, being in the right place at the right time. And then later in your book, so we're going to put it later in the conversation, you talked a little bit about, hey, you need to be intentional about where you align yourself in the organization, be able to identify mismatches and take action. So we'll get to that a little later, but what you just said of the shared vision, you talk about having the end in mind, right? And I like that idea of the end in mind for, somebody building a startup. I think that the end looks different than somebody within an organization trying to build a new line of business. You mentioned, you have to measure the right things. Might not be revenue, it might be something else. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the end, having the end in mind, but what that can look like in this broader organization.
That's right. And, some of that, especially if you're coming in new, takes some time to distill and refine so that the clarity of vision matches what else is going on in the organization. This goes back to the differences between being an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur. If you're an entrepreneur, you can just say, we're going to organize the world's information or whatever it is that you want to do. If you go into an existing company, there's some negotiation to be done. Even if you alone have clarity about at least the direction of where you need to go. In my experiences, this tends to take on multiple layers and have multiple layers. So for example, we knew that we wanted there at CNN to be a world-class source of news and information on mobile devices, and we wanted to be a leader in the field. Then we had to define what that meant, and that happens in different ways. We set a goal. In general, I don't talk about the specific numbers that we were using, but we had a very simple goal with revenue and unique users by a certain time. And when we had that and we worked on it as a team and we agreed on it, that had an amazing unifying effect. And that's at kind of this planning level and the communication level. And ultimately we drove toward that place with a lot of exciting things happening along the way. At the same time, there are more tangible and specific and sometimes shorter term goals. For example, launch the iPhone app. But it isn't just get an app out there, but get an app out there that lives up to the standards that we have for our world-class brand. And once you have clarity on that, that tends to drive some behaviors. For example, we had an app at one point that was pretty far along before we launched it. And there was a temptation to go ahead and put it out in the marketplace, assuming Apple would have approved it. And in this case, we said, we want to get it out into the marketplace. We had an advertiser who had actually purchased a sponsorship of the app and they wanted it in the marketplace. And we had to really look inside at our values and look at what our standards were for launching an app. And we said, you know what? This needs some more work. And so we went back. We had several other iterations of the app, including various people who are connected to it. I will never forget someone 2 levels up within the organization. She said, hey, you'll get the product right. We'll take care of all the other stakeholders here, including the advertisers. And she was good to her word. And so when you have advocacy and air cover to achieve the goals and know what your standards are, a lot of magic can happen.
And there's 2 things I want to fall back on. So you said we aligned on the vision. I would imagine that we is much broader than yourself and that technology leader. That's rolling up multiple levels in the organization to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I would also imagine that that would need to align all the way from the board down with what their strategic priorities are for the next 1, 3, 5 years.
That's precisely right. There's a whole lot of value that comes from essentially bringing together people who see the world and see the organization from different perspectives and creating a plan that's stronger than any one person could, no matter how good they are at what they do. Mm-hmm. And the way I like to do this is through an approach that I think of figuratively as a roundtable, where we essentially bring together people from different parts of the organization, including pretty broad functional representation. So you might have somebody, again, from marketing, product, technology, sales, HR, legal, finance, you name it, because each person understands their part of the organization. Of course, there's the substantive part of this, which is you get a better outcome, but there's also the participation element and the understanding, because when people are part of shaping this, then they tend to feel a sense of ownership. If somebody comes in and just says, hey, here's where we're going, and sometimes you have to do that. If you got a specific objective and a specific amount of time and there's a person who's the expert in the field, I'm not going to say never ever do that, but almost always the substance is better and the participation and buy-in and support are better if you have a group of people shaping the path rather than one person imposing it. And that is one of the through lines of all the major successes that I've been a part of, which is we've had a talented group of people coming together to make it happen.
I love that. And that reminds me of the book Sprint, where in Google they were going and conducting innovation sprints. And one of the things that they talked about was the importance of bringing leaderships or stakeholders in early and have them as part of the ideation process. And there's this whole psychological impact there where it's, if you were part of coming up with the idea, you have a sense of ownership and you become emotionally invested in it. So it's like a little bit of a game that you play. You want to create the idea, you have a bit of a vision, and now you are helping to shape and guide that with your stakeholders up front, right? Early in the process.
That's exactly right. And, one of my learnings from along the way also is that it's important to do this at different levels within the organization. You might have a group of people, and each of the people represented, essentially, they understand a certain area of the organization. But sometimes if you have someone who is earlier in their career or more entry level, they will add some important elements to the overall approach. And certainly from time to time, you'll want to have communications with people upward within the organization and not just your boss, but your boss is maybe the most important person. And so that, you don't necessarily just have some big reveal most of the time, but rather you have a situation where you anticipate what the needs are going to be. You communicate and share what's coming. You get feedback. So by the time you have, for example, a business plan or a product plan or a sales plan or, a specific goal, you already know or have a high degree of confidence that the reception is going to be warm because you've already tested the waters. And you make sure not just that it has the logical and structural integrity, but it's consistent with the strategy of the company. One of the biggest mistakes people make sometimes is to get all excited about a certain project, but then for whatever reason, usually it's not 90 degrees off of where the strategy is, but even if something is 10, 20, 30 degrees off of the direction the most senior leaders in the organization are taking, that makes for a tough road unless you really see something that other people don't see.
Got it. So one of the things I'm thinking, because what I'm hearing is that there is a lot of productive noise that you're making, right? You're being very open and communicative about this. And, as I'm thinking about some of the other innovations coming from enterprise legacy type companies, you think about groups that form skunkworks. I think Lockheed, they called it skunkworks groups, which is very, very different. They're still innovating inside an organization, but they're very secretive about it. I'd imagine there's a positive and negative of each approach. Skunkworks seems like it'd be a lot riskier.
Yep. It depends on the environment and depends on the need. And Clayton Christensen in The Innovator's Dilemma addresses this some too. Every now and again, you just need to separate people so that they can work on a thing and not be distracted and not be stopped. At least with the exception of a small group of people who are providing oversight, right? On the other hand, most innovation in the large organizations I've been a part of, these sorts of projects have touched many groups. Let's take the Weather Channel, for example, and let's say we have a big, thriving TV network. And let's say this is around 2008, 2009, 2010. Big, thriving TV network that generates most of the cash in the business. And then you have weather.com, which is fast growth on desktops with a lot of promise. And then you have mobile, which is relatively nascent. The users are expanding rapidly, but the revenue is lagging behind. There are a whole lot of touch points, not just for this mobile business. It's not self-contained. But on the other hand, the infrastructure we used was directly connected to weather.com, even though the way we presented ourselves in the marketplace, those were very different. And then the Weather Channel TV network was a great way for us to leverage the Weather Channel brand. And sometimes the on-camera meteorologists who were in the field covering an event, they'd be using the phone or looking at the radar map on their phone, and they were demonstrating the utility. And so the idea then is to look at the other platforms or divisions as assets and ways to magnify success, not blockers. Again, when they're strategically aligned. And then coming back to your point, sometimes you do need a group that is separate. And you saw that a lot with Bell Labs back in the day. Xerox had some examples of that. You can look at companies like Apple today, where you have, certain projects that are highly sensitive and only a few people know about these. And this has been publicly reported. There are times for that. My experience is that those times are relatively rare. And if you're disconnected, then you lose opportunities in many ways. And then the last comment on this, there's an exception. And the exception is when the organization is optimized for the ongoing business. And so anytime you have something new, essentially the big steamroller of an established company makes the new opportunity essentially have no way to grow. That's a great time to essentially have a separate place as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think to what you're saying, having these secretive groups and these projects that still require funding, one of the things I see, it also depends on if the stakeholder, the leader that is advocating for it is high enough, it's going to happen. And I'm thinking, Jeff Bezos coming in and saying, Alexa is going to be a thing. And that it's a $14 billion loss, but that's his pet project. Nobody's going to tell him no. So I could also see you get a sponsor that high, you're going to be able to go for it. So the second half of the book, you get into the organization, but I wanted to touch on one more thing about the individual. You mentioned you had the app, you were getting ready to launch it, and you and the team felt it didn't meet the brand standards, and you said no. You talk so much about integrity in your book and the importance of having values and living to that. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it is really, really important.
It's critically important. And for those of us who have been fortunate enough to live in and work in organizations that essentially require integrity and expect it and live it every day, it's easy to take that for granted. And at the same time, if you go around the block once or twice, you start to see some interesting behaviors from time to time, even in the best organizations, at least in my experience so far. And then you learn not to take that for granted, and instead to continuously reinforce it and live it and kind of expect it and communicate about it every day in some way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the way we see it manifesting itself, an example, or the way we see it manifesting itself in the course of business, sometimes they're very simple things. Like if somebody in the organization says, hey, you're doing an expense report, why don't you say this even though that happens? The answer is no. It's absolutely not. But there are more diplomatic and less diplomatic ways to say that, but the answer is the same. And it helps if you have everybody in the organization walking that talk. When you don't, you get into situations that are either exposed to or that bring about serious fraud. Just let's take Enron or Theranos as examples. And so it's very important as an entrepreneur to also be an ambassador of integrity and honesty along the way. And if we do that, that engenders trust. And when we engender trust, the trust helps with the everyday workings of the organization. It helps with the delivery of major projects. And ultimately, it helps with lifting people up.
And I think that's really important. It's one of those things that the top sets the actions and the philosophies of the company, right? If they're loose on people's integrity, that filters down, right? And then it starts to compound. Oh, if this is okay, that's okay. If that's okay, this is okay. And, I've seen it in consulting, and this is still a problem in consulting. They talk about ghosting hours. I'm on a project 40 hours a week, but it took me 80 hours because we were some external circumstance. It was not scoped correctly. We were waiting on information, X, Y, and Z, right? It's not the person's fault.
Right.
And their leader comes in and says, I know that you worked 80 hours, but we only have budgeted 40. I need you to do 40. Or sometimes it's even worse. It's like, you only have 20 hours. And just that always was an indicator to me that this part of the organization is lacking integrity, because they're basically making it the end employee's problem. I'm working 80 hours. I only get credit for 20 hours.
100%. And then you get into some really interesting and sometimes nuanced discussions about how to hold up the highest standards of unquestionable integrity while navigating through some real needs. Just to pick that up, and I haven't thought this through thoroughly, so I want to reserve the right to, find a better way. But let's say hypothetically that you do have a situation where the budget is only 40 hours and the project takes 80 hours. Then there are ways to only charge the client for 40 hours because that's the promise you made to them. But to acknowledge internally, so it's visible to anyone who needs to know it, that actually it took 80 hours.
Yep.
Right? And because it would be nice if we lived in a one-dimensional world, and a lot of these things, frankly, are very cut and dried. It's either true or not. Are you doing truth-telling or promise-keeping? Sometimes you end up in a situation, and the one you raised is a really nice one, because if you have a commitment to a client for a certain dollar amount, you need to keep that commitment. If the team member worked X number of hours, you want to reflect that any place where it matters, and then you need to find a gathering place, and that's where you need people who do exactly what you described before, which is walk the talk, and people who can deal with a little bit of ambiguity where there isn't essentially the manual that says, if this, then do that thing. Although the situation you just described probably is common enough that it could use that. But overall, people can use discretion. And when you have leaders who are kind of working with this level of commitment and integrity consistently, and they're modeling that, then when you get to the hard things that don't necessarily have an entry in the virtual manual, they know what to do.
That's a great lead into the organization side of things, because as an entrepreneur, you have your day job a lot of times, and then you're coming into this new initiative. So going back to the 80 hours in a little bit of a different point of view, we're not talking so much about ghosting hours to client. We're talking about somebody who is passionate about a new thing, who now works their day job and then works a night job moonlighting for this new team. And you said just now, it's not cut and dry. What do you do with that person? You have to have a way to recognize the above and beyond work that they're doing. And you listed a number of different ways. Compensation, right? How are you going to compensate them is one, but you had a number of other ones that were not as tied to monetary incentives. So let's talk a little bit about recognizing people's hard work and dedication.
Absolutely. I think the entrepreneur that gets to focus solely on one major thing over an extended period of time is the exception, not the rule. Most entrepreneurs that I know are pulled in multiple directions, and many of them essentially have a day job. And then to your point, they have something that is, at least at the beginning, off the side of their desk and not officially part of their job. And then if it's really an interesting growth opportunity, it might become part of their job. But the question becomes, if you add something on, what do you do about everything else? Are you taking something off? In terms of motivating people, my experience is that anybody who's successful in this line of work has natural curiosity. And anybody who has that natural curiosity and wants to contribute, they're going to be willing to jump in for things other than just the compensation. And I don't know of anybody, maybe there's somebody out there who does it primarily for the money. After a certain point, you obviously need to be able to, pay some of the basic bills and beyond. But after you get to that point, it becomes more about accomplishment and working with people you like and contributing in valuable ways and learning. And so there are all sorts of ways to provide recognition to people who are doing a great job, and many of which really aren't financial at all. There are ways to ensure that there is a collaborative team environment. That, speaking of CNN, the head of CNN when I was there was a guy named Jim Walton. And Jim would often say something that I've never forgotten. He would say, if you add, delete. If you add, delete. And so we try to be disciplined then, and I try to be disciplined now about understanding if we're putting something else of any size on a plate, then what comes off of it? Because otherwise you just get to a point where you can't absorb it all. A couple other things. Number one, there are times when you just have to push. And, we're all pushed to the boundaries of our capacity. And that becomes a time where you don't ideally forget that you got to take care of your health. If you do, your body will remind you. And so, the sprints, the pushes, those happen in any job, but there needs to be some amount of balance in there, some amount of taking breaks, some amount of easing up. You can't continuously sprint over a long period of time. Okay. And the second thing is, as it relates to a longer period of time and going back to the compensation, you want to have reasonable compensation overall. For many of us, that includes a base salary and a bonus. For some people, that includes commission and other forms of incentives, options or whatnot. One of the most effective ways I've found for companies to provide incentives to team members who are really contributing in this way and thinking about the long term is a long-term incentive plan, or an LTIP. And when a company puts that in place, and typically the timeframes will be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, sometimes a little less, maybe sometimes a little more. That tends to be very effective, and it can also be milestone based. So whether you do it purely based on a period of time, or whether you base it on a milestone, like, launch this product and get it to a certain point, or hit a certain revenue milestone, or hit a certain profit milestone, those tend to be very motivating as long as they're constructed in a thoughtful way.
Mm-hmm. That makes a ton of sense because, again, you're taking additional risk, and your risk is your time and your energy, right? And you mentioned this way late in your book, and we'll jump ahead in the conversation a little bit, but Gen Z coming into the workforce and the mentality that companies are not going to commit to you. There is no security. Don't give more than your 40 hours. Like, this is just being hammered in on TikTok and Instagram, and everybody's talking about it. And, I will recognize there's some truth in it. Things have been changing. I'll also recognize this is a very popular topic and gets eyeballs. So people are going to exaggerate, and, there's a mix, right? But what are you seeing now with Gen Z? And when we talk about long-term incentives, and their runway at a company is like 2 years, I'm out. You're probably going to fire me. I'm not even going to be 100% committed.
Sure. So first of all, I find myself very encouraged by Gen Z. I've spoken with a number of people who are relatively early in their careers by definition, if they're in Gen Z. Also, I've been speaking at multiple universities, and the energy and the dedication and the ideas and the desire to make a positive difference in the world. I think we're seeing a lot of promise here. Mm-hmm. Next, as it relates to the dynamic in companies, that we need to acknowledge some of the changes in expectations. And, there've been a lot of layoffs and a lot of departures of people from various companies. And often these are through no particular action or lack of action on the part of the person who's affected and the teams that are affected. And so it is important to remember at a certain point that most everyone is a free agent, but that doesn't change the dynamic of creating a great work environment where you want people to be lifted up as long as they're there, want them to have an opportunity to contribute as long as they're there, and understand how their skills and talents can best be used so that they grow. One of the things that I mentioned also in the book is that, from my perspective, the best leaders always put the team member first. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that we abdicate our responsibility to be good stewards of the organization. And the ones that I'm thinking about generally are companies. That doesn't mean that we forget about doing all the things we're responsible to do. But on the other hand, if we think about people first, individuals and groups of people, that tends to have really positive effects along the way. And then, there's a lot to be said on that. One other point I want to make as it relates to, the amount of work. You mentioned what's popular and only work your 40 hours and whatnot. Maybe that works for some people. And in fact, there is a book that is not Gen Z that is about the 4-hour work week. And that gets advocated a little bit too. So I don't think this is a particularly new idea. But I'll tell you this, I've never seen anyone who has accomplished great things as an intrapreneur or an entrepreneur, and I know a lot of both, who has just worked their 40 hours and called it a day. Now, maybe they get to a point in their life, in their career, where they're set or something else is important to them, but it just doesn't work that way for most people. So I would say that's a very big outlier. And then you got to decide, how much you want to put in. My perspective is, whether it's Gen Z, whether it's millennials, whether it's Gen X, whether it's boomers or anyone else, all of us have the opportunity to contribute in really valuable ways. And we should absolutely take care of ourselves. And that includes some reasonable amount of balance. But I don't know anybody who's going to accomplish a whole lot over a sustained period of time without having periods of time where it's just heavy duty and you got to lean in.
sometimes you have to grind.
That's right.
That's what it is. But, then let's go back to the topic that we put on pause from earlier. You have to be able to identify as an individual when you are in the right place, when an organization is supportive versus not supportive. And I'll give a quick example from my experience, because this is something that I've been on both sides. I've been on the side where I've been under a leader who's very supportive. Go innovate. We're going to sponsor you. We're going to do it. And then I've been under leaders who seemingly knew how to say no because they didn't know how to say yes, which basically means is they understood a bit of the framework that you mentioned, organizations, and how can they streamline the approval process of innovation, right? How did they think about this stuff? So they knew enough to challenge what you came to them, but they either didn't have the confidence, position, or experience to say yes. So they just block you, and that's it.
The skill of saying no within large organizations can be finely developed and honed over many years of experience. And people who are good at it, at some level, you got to admire it. It's like artistry. It's like, how many different ways can you stop good ideas? Unfortunately, that's bad for the organization. And so, healthy organizations that are going to sustain innovation and growth over a long period of time understand how to get the balance right between doing appropriate risk management. It's very important. No is not always bad. I can tell you many stories of where somebody has told me no and they were right. That's a personal experience. But on the other hand, if the Weather Channel had sat on the sidelines for a couple of years, waiting for the industry to give more signals as to what was going to work or not, we would have been way behind compared to our competition. And I think that that's true today. In some ways, the speed of change is even faster and multifaceted. AI, for example, introduces a dynamic. Now, I think many people have observed, and I agree with it, that we've seen just successive generations of innovation. So I don't think that everything we're seeing now is brand new in terms of the concept, but some of the specifics are new. Long story short, the balance, once again, is important, where you have the ability to say yes to things that are strategically aligned and where they can be accomplished by the organization. And you also find ways to make sure that the people who are inclined to say no at the wrong times do not have the final say.
And then you as an individual, when do you and how do you begin to make the decision that my energy is not going to be appreciated in this organization and now we need to make a change?
That's a really important thing to understand. And my first comment would be that many people stop too soon trying to find a way. And it's very, very important to take personal accountability for the things each of us do or the ways that each of us shows up that ultimately might impede accomplishing goals and lifting people up, okay? So I want to start with a point about personal ownership. But let's assume for a moment that we've exhausted a reasonable portion of those and we find that it just isn't working. There's a cultural mismatch. The culture is fine, but the organization isn't ready to move ahead. Then another one is if you have a lot to offer, but your boss isn't being supportive, either passively because they're just, paying attention to other things, or actively if for whatever reason there's a misalignment between you and your boss. All those times are ones where I would advocate find some place where you can contribute and be happy. And, sometimes you need to or want to stick it out for a longer period of time. Maybe there's a financial incentive or need. Maybe there are so many other offsetting benefits of the organization or the team that you're with But in general, I think organizations and teams should value the people who are in them. And if somebody feels like they aren't seeing that kind of value that respect that you would expect, then it's about time to look someplace else and find a way to apply yourself. So just wrapping up a comment on this, we could have an all-day session on this topic. However, for starters, too many people point their fingers at the other person. I can tell you I've done that in the past, and it's taken, some number of years for me to recognize better the things that I am best equipped to succeed in, and the environments and the places where I'm not as well equipped. And I think that's true for a lot of other people. And I've coached a lot of people on this by this point in my career. And at the same time, when you hit a point where you think, hey, this just isn't working, you might just be right. And instead of getting all spun up and going home every day and talking to whoever it is who you trust, or your dog or your guinea pig, and, just saying, can you believe such and such did so-and-so? If you're doing that too much, it's time to look for another option where you will be valued and you can contribute.
I think that is really great advice, especially when we think about burnout. And I like to think about burnout in terms of, where's your emotional energy being spent, right? That's a lot of emotional energy just surviving. You're not going to contribute. I like the way that you put it, contributing a disproportionate value to the cost that you're incurring, right? And that's both the innovation, the product that you're trying to build, but also I think for yourself too. Like if you can bring your best self and say, I can contribute at this level, that's great. You're going to be a rock star. But if your emotional energy is drained, you hit that point of, I can't remember what it's called, where, anyway, you can't contribute to the best of your ability. The law of diminishing return.
Yes.
That's what it is. I think you're no good to anybody, but you're no good to yourself. And I realized the conversation drifted a little bit to resilience, but I mean, everything is resilience.
Resilience is huge here. And you just reminded me of a very important concept that applies to intrapreneurs in a big way. It also applies to entrepreneurs and others as well. And that is, there isn't necessarily a single path. And there's a book called Designing Your Life that I recommend to others, and I've read myself several times. And one of the positions that the authors take, their names are Dave Evans and Bill Burnett, they take the position that there isn't such a thing as living your best life. You hear the comment, he or she is living their best life. And they say, actually, that drives them crazy. I'm paraphrasing here. And the reason is they don't believe there's any such thing. Rather, they think there are multiple paths, each of which have trade-offs. That's great news for entrepreneurs, because for those of us, and I want to go back to what you said about if somebody's feeling kind of stuck, either they can't drive the innovation they want, or the environment has a values mismatch or whatnot, it's easy to assume that that's the only good option or the only great option. And in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all of us, I think this is what those authors would say, all of us have multiple great options. And so getting back to practically what you do, at a certain point, if you say, hey, I think it's time for me to do something else, then you can step back and come up with at least 3 different options, expand the way you think. And one of my favorite sayings is, don't let the rim of your rut define your horizon, or don't let the rim of your rut become your horizon. If you think that way, then all of a sudden you increase optionality. And oh, by the way, for people who do that, every now and again, it's not about leaving their organization. It's about leaving potentially where they are in the organization and going someplace else where they can contribute with a fresh, amount of energy and a fresh perspective.
Wholly agree with that. there are some companies that are great companies. There are some leaders that are difficult leaders. And it doesn't mean that you have to leave the entire company, especially if you can align with some of their goals. You just have to find a better place. So with that in mind, if I were the leader in the organization, what are some of the things that I really should be thinking about and should be top of mind when I'm thinking, hey, we need to continue to be innovative in order to have some level of dominance in our market?
So for starters, and I'm going to look at this primarily through the lens of intrapreneurship here, it's helpful to understand the top characteristics of successful entrepreneurs and look for that for people you want to be in a role where they're driving innovation and change. The top characteristic that came through in my research is curiosity. The next one is action orientation. The next one is the ability to build bridges. The next one is risk tolerance. And the last one is optimism, especially grounded optimism. So it's rooted in an understanding of the situation, but you keep an eye on the goal and you can kind of help people to move in that direction. The risk tolerance is interesting because most people who are entrepreneurs, they, on the one hand, they're willing to try things. They're willing not to succeed. But on the other hand, they like having some of the infrastructure and protection of an established organization, right? This ability to build bridges, working backward in terms of the ones that I just mentioned, the ability to work with different types of people around the organization, close to you, far from you, outside the organization, but essentially to bring the best from different people and have them understand how to participate. That's a huge deal. And I'll finish up on the action orientation. I think we already touched on curiosity earlier, but you want to have somebody who at a certain point, even if you don't have all the facts, and even if, you don't have all the people and resources, you find a way to move ahead. You find a way to take the next step and you understand directionally where you're going. But a lot of the time it's an iterative process and experimentation. So for the person who really wants everything buttoned up before you start, can be a tough road for an entrepreneur. But on the other hand, if you have a desire to start with the end in mind, generally, and the flexibility to adjust as you learn, that tends to be very promising.
And those 5 key elements, is that something that you would expect a singular person to have? Or is that something where you can understand I'm grounded optimist, pragmatic optimist, like you say, and I need to pair myself with somebody who can understand risk and provide some tolerance to that can understand this and kind of build your team to say, okay, we have complementary sets of the 5 skills?
I certainly believe that it's important to leverage strengths, and that's another thing that I would advise a leader to do, to your question earlier. However, in general, all successful entrepreneurs have a significant portion of those top 5. It's rare that you find someone who's really accomplished without having at least, a reasonable amount. On the other hand, you might end up with somebody who's highly action oriented and somebody who is both particularly optimistic, again, in a grounded way, but, likes to be a little more thoughtful, but they're excellent at communication. So you can certainly essentially help to have people who are complementary. But for somebody who's going to be a driving force as an entrepreneur, you want to have all 5. And then, picking up on what you said, it's helpful to bring people together who complement each other. And then it's helpful to find projects and tasks that people get energized about. And then they can own it. And then it's helpful to stand back. One of my favorite concepts in management is this concept, and I mean this in a positive way in this context, is understanding when you're adding too much value. When you know you could do it faster, you could do it better, and you're probably right, and you step back anyway, because that's the catalyst for people who are working with you to learn. And maybe you give them some guidance every now and again, especially if you're asked. But a lot of the time, you have the wisdom and the, ability to say, I could do this, but it's their job. And part of my role as a leader is to help them develop. And furthermore, if they do it in their way, maybe they'll do it better than I would have because they see something I don't. By the way, this is great to do with Gen Z arrivals in the workplace. It's amazing what you can discover.
It reminds me of my time at Accenture when I was leading a team and, we're building cloud applications. I remember there was this big debate they were having around architecture and services. And I knew the answer. I knew the approach. And I remember very intentionally walking out the door saying, I'm going to let you figure this out because it doesn't help anybody. And yet that is so empowering to the team. It teaches the team and it gives them new experience. And with that word, I want to call back to another 2 words that you've said, the complementary, around complementary skills. Yes. But then also early on, you mentioned diversity a couple times. And personally, I'm not happy that diversity has become a politicized term. Talk to me about diversity a little bit, its importance, what you see when it works well. We'll stay with the what it works well.
Great organizations and great leaders have known for millennia that diversity is important. We're in a time now where the term has taken on some meanings for some people and groups of people that are not as positive or as literal as many of us intend when we use the word. I tend to talk these days more about valuing differences because of the way, specifically DEI, just to say it, but also, any one of those terms or others. Sometimes you get away from this fundamental truth that we need to value differences. We also constrain what that means. For example, how about the differences between introverts and extroverts on a team? How about people who are in different generations on a team? How about, obviously, we have some of the types of difference that are discussed often in our society. How about people who are in a technology-driven organizations, but they're liberal arts majors? The whole deal. And so we can give it whatever word we want to. We can navigate around whatever term, is loaded with certain meanings that, maybe have changed over time. At the end of the day, if we aren't valuing differences, we're not going too far.
Wholeheartedly agree. Difference in thought, backgrounds, experience. You're going to get such a holistic solution and a team that performs better. And bringing people together like that is just so important. And on the topic of bringing people together, as we close the conversation, I understand you're putting Inside Innovator Summit together. You work with teams and organizations. I would love for you to talk about that a little bit. I know it's coming, I think, in a month.
It is literally 4 weeks. 3 or 4 weeks from now, we'll be gathering a lot of people in Janesville, Wisconsin for the Inside Innovator Summit. And we're really excited about this event. We're going to have people from the Janesville, Beloit area, also Madison, also Milwaukee and Chicago. And at the same time, I am well aware that there are people who are traveling. In fact, we're working on the room block now because this has really generated a lot of interest. And there are at least 3 types of people who might be interested. The first is, a leader who's having some success with innovation and has that responsibility and wants to improve their game. The next is the leader and the innovator who wants to get unstuck, where they see it, they can feel it, they can taste it, and they just need to find a way to get past a certain hurdle that they're facing now. And the third one is a leader, especially a senior executive, who wants to create an environment that is conducive to world-class entrepreneurship, and they want to know how to do that. So we're super excited. And then I want to tie back to something you were just talking about before this question, in terms of what we can do as leaders to make sure that our teams are excelling. There's some combination of advocacy and empowerment. And so at the Inside Innovator Summit, we'll be helping people to understand where to strike that balance so that they can sustain success.
Amazing. I am very much looking forward to that. Any final thoughts that you want to add? And then how do leaders get in contact with you?
Oh, thanks for asking. So first of all, I find a lot of energy around this topic. I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, Louis, I didn't understand what an entrepreneur is. In fact, when I first heard about intrapreneurship, I had to look twice to see if it was misspelled, right? And on the other hand, this term has been in use for at least 40 years or 45 since Gifford Pinchot started using it. So I feel this sense of mission around underscoring what it is and the importance of inside innovation and entrepreneurship. And when we understand it, then we sometimes discover things about ourselves. So I find that very energizing. If people want to reach out to me, it's pretty easy. There is a website, cambionsolutions.com. CAM is in Mary, B is in basketball, IAN is in Nancy, solutions.com. Or they can find me on LinkedIn, and I would love to trade notes. And my business focuses on helping organizations to grow, and it also focuses on coaching for executives.
Wonderful. And we'll put all of the links in the comments, as well as a link to the Kindle version of your book on Amazon that you were just saying is being featured right now.
It is, right now, and I don't know how long this is going to last, but at the moment it's available for 99 cents on Kindle, in addition to the hardcover and the audiobook. And I found that some people are coming to me and saying, hey, I want it on multiple platforms. And so for that group of people especially, it's super accessible right now, and I appreciate the support we're getting and the recognition.
That's great. Well, it has been absolutely phenomenal chatting with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks, and hope to have you again soon, because there's so many topics that we could deep dive into outside of this.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, AJ. I appreciate your real commitment to innovation and looking forward to more conversations.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.